Welcome to Vineyard Church Dungannon, where we're walking together deeper into faith. The following message was given at one of our Sunday gatherings. For more information, visit vineyarddungannon.co.uk.
So, Johnny introduced us to the idea of Daniel last week. If you didn't hear it, I'd encourage you to go back and just listen through it, for it really sets up for the next few weeks on what we're going to be speaking about. So, this morning I'm speaking on standing firm in society. So, I suppose first of all I want to ask a few questions. What influences you, or what influenced you as you grew up? I had depended on at least one builder. There's 3 or 4 builders in the congregation. I thought at least one of them would have been here, but they are not, so they've left me hanging with that one. Let's see. Did I get it work? Great. Brilliant. So I'll just carry on and pretend that they're here, okay? So did you grow up around builders? Or did you pick up, if you did, you probably would have picked up, I was on a building site whenever I was 15, 16, and you picked up on some of the language that was used. Perhaps something that you wouldn't bring home and talk to your mother about. You also would have picked up the names and terms for different things in the job site, I suppose, and there was an initiation process for new starts on a building site. You would have been sent for a long stand or stripy paint or such things like that. So that's the culture around a building site, or the environment that you come into whenever you're in that. I also grew up on a farm. I learned how to milk cows. I learned how to shovel manure. And I got quite good at that part. Drive tractors. I grew to know the phrases and the description of things, like he's as stubborn as a beast in a ditch, you couldn't turn him. Again, there's all these things, the characteristics of being there on a farm, growing up, and everything that surrounded you, and there was a culture of a cup of tea. You were brought in, you had a cup of tea and a sandwich. Everything was discussed and made around the table, which is why I love it here. There's always tea or coffee or sandwiches or biscuit or buns on the go, so it suits me well. So what was it like in Babylon? Oh, sorry, wrong way. And I might just have to hand over to you to do that. I can't get this thing. Yeah, Babylonian country, there we go. I'll let you flick it on, is that all right? So what was Babylon like? Well, Babylon was a highly structured environment or culture. It was very patriarchal. The men were high up, women low down, women and children very low down on the pecking order. Though it was deeply religious, but not as how we would know it. They were, in religious terms, it was polytheistic, where they had many, many gods. They believed in one supreme god, which was Baal or Marduk, and then they had little gods, many various little gods below that. So at the time of Daniel, roughly around 605 BC, God gave permission for King Nebuchadnezzar to come into Babylon, as Johnny had spoke about last week, and come in and conquer Jerusalem. Now, God, from time to time, permits these things to happen. He doesn't create bad things. He doesn't make people have cancer. He doesn't make people fall sick or be in a car crash. But sometimes he permits certain things to happen. And he allowed this to happen just to bring his divine judgment on the people of Judah, on all the Jews and the Hebrews. He brought this in because Judah were persistently walking away from God. They were very unfaithful. They weren't sticking to God's way and God's will. They moved from worshiping Yahweh, the one true God, to idolizing things, idolizing money, people, figures, all that kind of stuff. So part of this was to bring his divine judgment on them. They also allowed, and in a lot of cases actually encouraged social injustice. They would trample all over the people on the margins just to get them a higher standing in society. They failed to listen to the prophetic warnings of repentance. God sent loads of people to speak to them, to tell them to turn from their ways, to repent and seek God's forgiveness. But they turned away from prophets like Jeremiah and didn't pay much heed to them. Next slide, please. So basically, this punishment was for all the years and generations of disobedience. Wonder how many warnings did you get as a child whenever you were doing something wrong? Or could your mum sort of see you were starting to do something wrong? Me, not too many. I got a look. Mum only usually gave you one look, and then after that, you paid the price. I'm sure there's a few here got the look. Peter, James, Johnny. I wouldn't say you, Cheryl. You're too good. Next slide, please. So Daniel 1 verse 4, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So when King Nebuchadnezzar came in, oh dear, technology, don't like technology. When King Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered the city, the young men were taken away. And within that, 4 young men of the tribe of Judah were taken: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So not only were they taken from their homes, where they would have known privilege because of their royal lineage, they were moved to Babylon, but they also had their names changed. Their names were changed to Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. From now on, I'm just going to say Daniel in the first one. Okay, so that's not to be mixed up with Belshazzar that Johnny was talking about last week, the second king, the king after Nebuchadnezzar. So they had all had their names changed. Next slide, please. What we must remember here is that names were very significant to the Israelites. They weren't just a way of pointing out who someone was or identification. They reflected a person's character or a family's character or where they were from or perhaps a divine purpose or their faith and identity. Like God sometimes changed the names of people signaling a new covenant or a new role, like Abram and Jacob, where they became Abraham and Israel. So having their name changed was insulting to them. But you have to see as well from King Nebuchadnezzar's side of things, it was to wipe out who they were, what they were culturally, and bring them in, because they essentially were going to be working for him. So that he wanted them brought into the ways of Babylon. So when to add salt to the wounds, Daniel's new name also meant Baal, protect the king. The Baal here is referencing the supreme god, Baal, whereas Daniel means God is my judge. So it's a big, massive thing having their names changed. So they've had their names changed. They had to learn all about Babylonian life, its culture, its beliefs, its literature, as they were to serve the king and know how everything worked in Babylon. Daniel and co would have had to learn a lot of things that they wouldn't have agreed with, a lot of ungodly things, like the Babylonian creation story. That all involved primordial soup and humans coming up out of it and being designed basically to serve the pagan gods of the day. And this totally went against everything Daniel and those guys all grew up believing and learning, and against their convictions. But Daniel accepted everything that was put on him. His name, his learning, the culture, even the way they dressed was different to the way it was back in Jerusalem. But he accepted it. He stayed faithful. He held on to the teachings that he grew up with. He held on to that relationship that he had with Yahweh God. And he put his trust in him, even in this situation of captivity. Linda, will you come up and read for us, please? Flick on to the next one, Anna.
Aye. If any of you have your Bibles or have it on your phone, or is it going to appear? Oh, it's going to appear there too. So this is Daniel 1, verses 5 and 8 to 16. So the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. So essentially, speaking there that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah ate what would now be called a vegan diet. I say that with no disdain or anything in my voice. Only vegetables, whole foods, no animal products, and only drank water. Now, I am about to say it here. So if you're a vegan and listening here, or you're listening online later, please don't be emailing in and don't take offence. But I see Paula Kelly's there. If there's any emails, please send them to her. That would be great. Sorry, they lost the place. Yeah. So one thing that I've seen, and I've met a few vegans in the past, is that they just don't look very healthy. And I know that can be harsh, but the vegan diet isn't good for people. Even science will tell you that on its own. Now, today you can go to Ollins and Cookstown or Halton Barts and pick up amino acids and complex proteins and fats and whatever 3 for 2 offer is on now. You can go and do that, but back then on that day, you couldn't do that. So everything you got, all the nutrients you got had to come from your food, what you ate and what you drank. Excuse me. So they could only get that from the food they had. Go to the next one, please. Next slide. So instead of living in the culture and the environment that surrounded them and eating the luxurious food and wine given to them, they only ate the vegetables and drank water. And you may say, well, what's the big deal about eating the king's food that had been given to them? Well, the meats and the wines and drinks in those days were all offered up to idols and false gods. So that was totally against the Mosaic law. That they weren't allowed to eat those things that was offered to pagan gods. So they stayed faithful to God, and God stayed faithful to them. Like, imagine the choice: a steak and a glass of wine, or a plate of Brussels sprouts and a glass of water. You know, I really do know which I would love to be eating, and it would be difficult to pass up on the steak. But they did it. They stayed faithful, and they stayed faithful to that culture of faithfulness that was ingrained in them growing up, that trust and that faith in God, that He would provide everything that they needed in whatever form that come. Next slide, please. So because of their faithfulness, God blessed them so that they got everything they needed, all the proteins, the fats, everything that they needed from the vegetables. And they looked healthier than those who ate from the choice foods and wine from the king's table. If you move on to Daniel 1, verse 18 to 21, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel and co. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service, In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So if we look back, these 4 young men were taken from their homes forcibly. They were taken to Babylon, excuse me, as prisoners. They had to learn everything about the place. They had to learn a new language, a new culture. They had to learn the people, how things went, how things worked, the environment. It was a totally new environment to them. Next slide, please. And yet they still progressed. They excelled and became wiser than all those ones that actually grew up in Babylon, who grew up knowing all the stories, knowing the language, knowing how things worked. They overcame those difficulties. So they were elevated up into positions of power under the king in Babylon. We see in Daniel 2 that Daniel was in fact put in charge of all Babylon and in charge of the wise men. So this is how far they come with their learning. They surpassed those guys that grew up there and then moved on and actually became wisest of all and in control. And this was all possible because God was with them and blessed them in their learning. I'd just like to add something here that plays out later on in the biblical story. So I'm not great with geography. I don't know if you guys are, but Babylon was east of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And there's a reference that you would know of wise men or magi coming from the east, which is the birth of Jesus. It's believed that Daniel, as head over all the wise men in Babylon, passed on the knowledge to these guys of what to look for in the skies, what signs and wonders to look for that would tell or signify the birth of the king, the real king, King Jesus. And this in turn was passed down through the years until that time came. Would the wise men have come from the east bearing gifts to Jesus if Jerusalem hadn't have fallen to Babylon 605 years earlier? Who knows? Well, it might have. God works these things out, but imagine that's 605 years in the making from there till they came to worship the king being born. That's just amazing. That sort of blew my mind whenever I was reading all through this and researching this up. So things to remember. Next takeaways even. 1, we will be influenced by certain things in present culture. That will happen. That's life. It's all about the environment that you're in, whether that is working on building sites and shops, or perhaps it's where you grew up. Maybe you grew up in a household or an environment where addiction was a big thing. You know, we have many friends that have, many guys that we're praying for that have grew up through addiction in the families. You know, if you grow up in that environment of addiction, you're 75% more likely to follow down that path and become involved in drink and drugs, even smoking. If you grow up around smokers, you're 4 to 5 times more likely to begin smoking. So all of this is to do with your environment. So what's your environment like now? Well, we are called to be in the world, but not of it. God calls us to be set apart, to be holy. That doesn't mean that you don't interact with the guys with addiction, with the guys who smoke, or the builders, the bakers, the candlestick makers. That's not what it's saying. But it's saying that we live a different way, showing them a way to be with Jesus, a good life. Gives them something to look forward to. And I know myself, I always have hope now and joy, no matter what circumstances is surrounding me, is because Jesus is there with me. 3, God's timing and God's plans are way beyond our comprehension. You know, it's just back to those 605 years of those guys between Jerusalem falling and Jesus' birth. And that plan, is a unified story. The Bible is a unified story from Genesis to Revelation, and the amount of times you can see it bouncing back and forward. I tried to find the picture of all the connections, but I didn't get it. But it's just amazing. It just blows your mind how God can time everything and put someone in your path to turn you a different way. Anyway, his plans are good. He is faithful, even when we're not. He is faithful. Always. Always. Next slide, please, Anna. So stay faithful, stand firm, stand close to Jesus. Let his culture, his kingdom culture, influence you the most. Be in those environments, be in those spaces and places where God is. Be here on a Sunday morning. Be here on a Sunday morning. God is here. Jesus is always thick in this room. Go to your community groups. Those are just more places and spaces for you to be where you can connect with other Christians. You can speak about what's going on in your life. You can get advice. And Jesus will break through. He will. He'll make a way. So I think that's the biggest thing, is to stay close to Jesus in your walk. You will be, from time to time, moved from side to side, but let Jesus bring you back on course again.
Thanks for listening to this message. For more information on what's happening in the life of our church, visit vineyarddungannon.co.uk.